As usual, let's go ahead and start with the Bible Project video. If I can get rid of all the stupid pop-ups that Microsoft likes to do.
Oh, it's talking. It's recording you.
It's lovely.
He said lovely.
No, let's not turn that on. I
It went on.
didn't read that.
Yeah.
Let's turn something on.
All the churches are there.
Yes.
That was funny.
Yeah.
The Gospel according to John. In the first video, we saw that John wrote this book to make the claim that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, the human embodiment of God's word and glorious presence, who has come to reveal who God truly is. Then we explored how John designed the first half of the book to demonstrate this claim. Jesus performed miraculous signs and made huge claims about himself, that he is the reality to which Israel's entire history points. And this all generates controversy, however, and the Jewish leaders confront Jesus for all these claims, and it culminated with Jesus laying down his life for his friend Lazarus. By going near Jerusalem to raise him from the dead, Jesus sealed his fate. And so once the plot to murder Jesus is set in motion, we come into the book's second half. The first part focuses entirely on Jesus' final night and last words to the disciples, as he tries to prepare them for his coming death. Jesus performs this shocking act at dinner. He takes on the role of a common servant by kneeling down to wash their dirty feet, something that in their culture a superior rabbi would never do for his disciples. And Jesus says it's a symbol of his entire life purpose, to reveal the true nature of God as a being of self-giving love. And it's also a symbol of what Jesus is about to do in becoming a servant and giving up his life to die for the sins of the world. And so this act leads to his great command to his disciples that they are to follow him by loving one another as he has loved them. Acts of loving generosity are to be the hallmark of Jesus' followers. This is what will show the world who Jesus is, and therefore who God is. And from here, Jesus goes into a long, flowing speech that's concluded with a prayer. And you'll find the whole thing is unified by a few repeated themes. Jesus keeps saying that he's going away, which makes the disciples sad, but Jesus says it's for the best because it means that he will send the Spirit, also known as the Advocate. As a human, Jesus can only be in one place at a time, but the Spirit can be Jesus' divine personal presence in any place at any time. And the Spirit will do a number of things, Jesus says. So remember, for John, the unique deity of the one God consists of that loving, unified relationship between the Father and the Son. Jesus says the Spirit is that loving personal presence that will come to live in his people and draw them into the love between the Father and the Son. And so, Jesus says, his disciples are the ones who abide or remain in that divine love, the way that branches are connected to a vine. He's describing here how the personal love of God can permeate a person's life, healing, transforming, and making them new. And there's more. The Spirit will also empower Jesus' followers to carry on his mission in the world. To first of all, fulfill the great command to love others through radical acts of service. But also, Jesus says, the mission is to bear witness to the truth, to expose and name the selfish, sinful ways that we as humans treat each other, and to declare that in Jesus, God has saved the world through him because he loves it. He's opened up a new way to become human again. And so finally, Jesus predicts that there will be opposition. Just as the Jewish leaders rejected him, so his followers will be persecuted. But he tells them not to be afraid, because he has already conquered or gained victory over the world. Now, what does Jesus mean by victory here? He doesn't say. But it leads us into the final section of the book, where John shows us what victory looks like, Jesus style. The Jewish leaders sent soldiers to Jesus and his disciples to arrest him. And when the soldiers ask which one Jesus is, he declares, "I am," and they fall backward. Now this is brilliant on John's part. These words are the culmination of 2 sets of 7 instances where Jesus has used that very phrase. And it all highlights one of John's core claims about Jesus. The words "I am," or in Greek, ego and me, they're the Greek translation of the Hebrew personal covenant name of God that was revealed to Moses back in Exodus chapter 3. It was also repeated many times in Isaiah. And John has strategically place 7 moments in his story where Jesus says, I am, followed by some astounding claim. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world, the gate for the sheep, the good shepherd, the resurrection, the way, the truth, and the life, the true vine. And John's also designed 7 other stories that have key moments where Jesus says simply, I am, echoing this divine name. And so here, this occurrence as Jesus is arrested is the ironic climax of all of them, because Jesus reveals his divine name and power and victory precisely at the moment that he gives up his life. After this, Jesus is put on trial for his exalted claims to be the Son of God and the King of Israel, first before the high priest and then before the Roman governor Pilate, who has to take seriously anyone who's charged with claiming to be the King of Israel. And Jesus tells Pilate that my kingdom is not from this world, meaning that he is a king and that his kingdom is for this world, but its radically different value system, its redefinition of power and greatness, none of this is derived from this world. Rather, they are defined by God's character that Jesus has revealed through his upside-down kingdom, which is epitomized by the cross. It's the place where the world's true king conquers sin and evil by letting it conquer him. And Jesus gains victory over the world through an act of self-giving love. After this, Jesus' body is placed in a tomb that is then sealed. And on the first day of the week, Mary and then later the other disciples discover that the tomb is strangely open and then empty. And then Mary, all of a sudden, she meets Jesus. He's alive from the dead. Now, the resurrection of Jesus connects back to another pattern in John's Gospel. So all the way back at the wedding party in Cana, when Jesus turned the water into wine, John told us that that was Jesus' first sign. And he also identified the second sign, the healing of the sick boy in chapter 4. But after this, John just lets you keep count. And if you have, you'll have noticed that the 6th sign was the raising of Lazarus from the tomb, which Jesus performed at the cost of his own life. And so that, and all of the signs, they point forward to this 7th and greatest sign at the culmination of the story, Jesus' own resurrection from the dead. It vindicates Jesus' claim to be the Son of God, the author of all life, whose love has conquered death itself. After the empty tomb, Jesus then meets up with all the disciples, and he commissions them by sending the Spirit as he promised, so that his mission from the Father can now be carried on through them. After this, the book concludes with an epilogue that explores the ongoing mission of Jesus' disciples in the world. So a number of them are fishing, and they're not catching anything. And so Jesus appears to them on the shore. They don't recognize him, though. And he tells them to cast their net on the other side of the boat. And when they obey him, they catch a huge amount of fish, and it's only then that they recognize him as Jesus. Now, John's offering here a picture of discipleship to Jesus. His followers will be most effective in the world when their focus is not on their work as such, but on simply listening for Jesus' voice and obeying him when he speaks. That's when they will truly see him at work in their lives. After this, Jesus talks with Peter and then commissions him as a unique leader in the Jesus movement, indicating that he too will give up his life one day. But in contrast to Peter, the last moments of the story focus on the author of this gospel, the disciple whom Jesus loved. And unlike Peter, his job was not to lead the Jesus movement, but rather to spend his long life bearing witness to Jesus so that others might believe in him. And that's actually what he's done right here by authoring this amazing story about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. And that's what the Gospel of John is all about.
There is so much in this gospel. All right. So, what we have here is a very artistic gospel, a very artistic piece of work. I think we can all agree. Anybody that's ever read the Gospel of John knows that it's artistry in a different way than we have with the other Gospels. And we talked about some of that last week. Here's another, and I think this is my only rather long quote from an author in here. This is, just as he, John, condenses the traditions of Jesus' healing and miracle-working activity down to a few select episodes that are given more extended development than the synoptic tradition, Matthew, Mark, Luke, So also, John focuses on a smaller number of Old Testament quotations. Each citation that does appear in John's uncluttered narrative assumes proportionately greater gravity as a pointer to Jesus' identity. If Luke is the master of the deft, fleeting allusion, like remember the description last week, or in our lesson on Luke about a play with the actors in front, but some sepia tone stuff going on the back that reflects Old Testament stuff, and sometimes they sync up, but then as soon as they sync up, they're moving on. Well, John is the master of the carefully framed, luminous image that shines brilliantly against a dark canvas and lingers in the imagination. In this respect, John's narrative technique is analogous to the visual artistry of Rembrandt's portraits. John is not attempting to compile the maximum number of illustrations of how Moses wrote about Jesus. He prefers to focus on the artistically selected instance that repays sustained meditation. That's what he thinks. Anyway, so speaking of Moses, here's Rembrandt's portrait of Moses. Now look at all that. There's a whole lot going on in the background there, but it's not detailed stuff. It's just stuff. It's like the glory of God or something, right? And Moses is holding up the tablets, and it's pretty decent Hebrew on that too. So hats off to Rembrandt for getting that well done. It's so much darker on my screen. Anyway, but you can kind of see some of what he does with the light. That's a little overexposed, I think, but his face and arms are much lighter, and the rest is darker by contrast. So we're talking about artistry like Rembrandt. By telling the stories about Jesus that John selects directly in conjunction with various Jewish institutions and festivals. Remember, we talked about that last week. John is able to do multiple things with each story. So each story does stand on its own, which is good, because that's normally how we read these things. And it does stand on its own, and that's sort of like the first level of meaning that we talked about last week. You can turn water into wine at a feast. Wow, right? He has zeal for God's house and drives out the money changers. He talks about rivers of living water flowing out of people. But each story also tells more by being tied with its contextual element, right? Isaiah 6:25 speaks of Yahweh, the Lord, providing fine aged wine at the end times banquet, which is a wedding feast. So he's turning water to wine at a wedding feast. This is definitely a connection for people who were intimately familiar with these prophecies, right? In the temple, where he's got zeal for God's house, it combines the expected return of the Lord to the second temple, which never happened, remember? After the second temple was built, the Spirit of the Lord did not come and fill the temple like it did with the first temple and the tabernacle. And so they've been waiting for this and hoping for it. Well, now Jesus has come, and he's filled the, Yahweh has arrived. And also in this whole thing, he replaces the temple in a lot of ways with his own body. And that helps with all that context. It's more than just driving out the money changers. He's saying a lot more. All right, rivers of living water. Well, at the Feast of Tabernacle, this connects Jesus with Yahweh's provision of water in the wilderness, because at the Feast of Tabernacles, all they're thinking about is stuff that happened in the wilderness, So when he says rivers of living water, he thinks about the rock that Moses struck and water came pouring out. And same when he says he's the bread of life, they think of manna, right, at the same festival. All right, well, just for fun, let's take a look at some of Rembrandt's work that is specifically related to some of the scenes that we have described in John. And so I've done a more decluttered frame here of the outline that the Bible Project put together, and sort of inserted some pictures. And by the way, each one of these pictures takes 3 complete different slides to make the following animation work. So that was tricky. I actually had to have ChatGPT help me do the animation. All right, so let's start with John the Baptist. See how he works the light in the center there with John speaking to the crowd, but you've got lots of stuff going on. Front center, you have some Pharisees sort of grumbling, about him and with their back to him, and they're kind of colluding against him. Other things are going on. You can see a person on a horse. You see a camel in the dark on the left there. In the front, there's some children. So there's a whole lot going on here. And of course, John and the people who are kind of really enraptured by him, surrounding him, but then there's also some looking at the Pharisees as well. So it's an interesting scene. Again, it's a little overexposed on that screen. So next, let's take a look at him driving out the money changers. Well, this is definitely more zoomed in than the other one, right? It's a very crowded picture here. You've got an angry Jesus who has shaved more recently than what we're used to. And money changers trying to save their money and get out of the way and not be whipped by a different whip than we're used to seeing in his hand. But that's not the point of the artwork, is how does Rembrandt do this stuff with light and a dark background and stuff like that. That's the point we're trying to make. Here's Jesus at the well. Oh man, this one's really overexposed. But the focus of the light is actually on the woman. And Jesus is he's got light on him, but it's not as much. So the focus is on the woman in this picture. And you can see a little kid peeking over the edge. I'm not sure what the point of that is, but it's definitely there and it means something. And then the rope or chain, whatever, that holds the bucket really stands out. Anyway, it's interesting to me. I figure if you're going to compare him to Rembrandt, you've got to look at a couple of Rembrandt pictures, right? Here's the resurrection of Lazarus, which is really cool, except for the fact that that's clearly not a first century tomb, but, he was painting in the 17th century, so we got to cut him a couple of breaks. And I also don't know what the swords and the bow and arrow and stuff hanging on the wall are supposed to mean, but really fascinating artwork to me. Here's the crucifixion. Not really anything going on in the background here. I don't think he wants us to be distracted, right? Again, good job on the 3 languages on the sign above his head. And the resurrection, same kind of tomb we had with Lazarus. You see the soldier, one of them's getting knocked over by I guess he was lying down on top of the tomb, and he got knocked over when the stone got popped off by the angel. But really fascinating work of light, I think. All right. So at the end of our video, he talked about John's use of sevens, and there's really 4 places. Last week, we talked about one of them, and then he talked about 3. So I thought we'd go through that. The one we talked about last week briefly, or in the video, we didn't really talk about it, was the 7 titles in John chapter 1, and it's actually condensed down to those verses I have listed there, 29, 34 through 40, and 45 through 49. So we'll just read through that real quick, and I've highlighted the titles. The next day he saw Jesus coming, he being John, to him, and said, "Behold the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world." And I myself have seen and have testified that this is the Son of God. Again, the next day, John was standing with 2 of his disciples, and he looked at Jesus as he walked and said, "Behold the Lamb of God." So he says it again. And the 2 disciples heard him speak, and they followed him. And Jesus turned and saw them following, and he said to them, "What are you seeking?" They said to him, "Rabbi," which translated means teacher, "where are you staying?" He said to them, "Come, and you will see." So they came and saw where he was staying, and they stayed with him that day. It was about the 10th hour. One of the 2 who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his own brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which translated means Christ. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses wrote in the law and the prophets also wrote, Jesus, the son of Joseph from Nazareth." Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good be from Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." See that we have the come and see in there twice? I thought that was interesting. Jesus saw Nathanael coming to him and said, "Here is truly an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." That's an odd saying, But remember the stories of Jacob, who was named Israel, and how deceptive he was. I think that's what we've got a reference here to. Nathanael said to him, "How do you know me?" And Jesus answered and said, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." Nathanael answered, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." So those are 7 titles, a couple of them in there twice. The Lamb of God and Son of God, and Rabbi are in there twice. So that's where they are. I don't have 7. Why don't I have 7? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I don't remember which one I missed. Okay, moving on. Sorry. So we also talked about 7 I am ... sayings. All right, and he went over those, so we'll just touch on those really quickly. I'm the bread of life. I'm the light of the world. I'm the gate for the sheep. I'm the good shepherd. I am the resurrection, the way, the truth, and the life, the true vine. All right? And I find this next group really interesting. Just simple I am. Ego eimi, with nothing following it. And this has created some controversy in translation amongst scholars, because if you wanted to say, "Hey, it's me," you would just say, "Ego eimi." So you're not saying I'm Yahweh when you say that, right? So a lot of your more modern translations will say things like "I am he," and you'll see the word "he" in italics, right? Because they added it trying to indicate that he's just saying, "Hey, it's me," right? But if we look at the context of some of these, especially the 7th, we'll see that John really is saying, "I am," like "I am Yahweh." And we'll see that here in just a second. So in chapter 4, verse 26, in response to the Samaritan woman at the well, we have, "The woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming. When that one comes, he will declare all things to us." Jesus said to her, "I am the one speaking to you." He's not saying, "I am the one speaking to you." It's definitely a "I am, comma, the one speaking to you." And on my translation, they put "he." "I am he" in italics, and I removed it for the purpose of this slide. And you know that, by the way, when you see in italics on your translations, that means it was added to help with the English. And usually they do an excellent job, really do. Occasionally they miss it a little bit because, we're all human. In chapter 6, in response to the disciples' fear as he's walking on the sea, they saw Jesus walking on the sea, not on the water, on the sea. Remember the meaning of that? Who walks on the sea? God does, right? He treads on the waves of the sea, it says in the Old Testament in a couple of places. All right, that's why it's important that it's the sea and not the water. It is water, of course, but that's not the point. Anyway, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "I am. Do not be afraid." In chapter 8, at the Feast of Tabernacles, he said to the Jewish leaders, "For unless you believe that I am, you will die in your sins." He's not saying, you believe that I exist. He was standing right in front of them. Obviously, he existed. He's saying a lot more, isn't he? They weren't real happy with that either. But, oh well. Number 4, chapter 8, also at the Feast of Tabernacles. And I think there's 3 of these at the Feast of Tabernacles. He said, Jesus said, "When you lift up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am." And a little later on, in verse 58, Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am." Not I was, I am. Number 6, at the Last Supper, when telling them about the betrayer, Judas, he says, "From now on, I am telling you before it happens, so that when it does happen, you may believe that I am." And the 7th one, at the arrest in the garden. And this is the one that really makes it clear what John's up to here. Jesus said, "Whom are you seeking?" And they answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." And he said to them, "I am." Now when he said to them, "I am," they drew back and fell to the ground. And he asked them again, "Whom are you seeking?" And they said, "Jesus the Nazarene." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am." So if you're seeking me, let these men go on their way. I mean, they fell to the ground. He's not just saying, hey, it's me. He said, I am, and they fell to the ground. It can't be a lot more clear than that. Unless he put a parenthetical statement that said, by saying this, he meant to identify himself with God, which is not how these folks wrote. So that would be too modern a thing to do. All right, on to the signs. So in the signs, when we say that there's 7 signs, it's not that you have to go through and count how many miraculous things did Jesus do, and there's 7. It's that there's 7 of them that actually use the word sign with it, okay? So there's other miracles that happen, but they didn't include the word sign, so those aren't counted. So there's 7 occasions with the word sign. The first one, turning the water into wine. In the text it says this is the beginning of his signs. And to help us understand the meaning, water held in 6 jars holding 20 to 30 gallons each. This is an overabundant amount. You know, we're talking, what is that, 120 to 180 gallons of wine. After they'd already gone through the other stuff. These parties lasted several days, by the way. This wasn't all in one night. Healing an official's son. It specifically says this is the second sign. And the son recovered when he was at the point of death at the very hour that Jesus spoke. Remember that story? This was a sign. Healing the crippled man on the Sabbath. This is the sign he was performing on the sick. So it says the word sign. He was paralyzed for 38 years. Interestingly, the only other place in the whole Bible where the number 38 appears is in Deuteronomy 2:14, where he's describing after they left Mount Sinai, they crossed a wadi, which is sort of like a creek for flooding mainly, and then they reached another wadi, which got them to the land right across from entering in the Jordan. From there to there was 38 years, it specifies in that verse. And the Father and Jesus are doing work on the Sabbath, he specifies. All right, feeding the 5,000. The people saw the sign that he had done, so this counts on our list. And he said, I am the bread of life. And this also parallels what he said a few verses later, I am the bread that comes down from heaven. And that clearly, the bread that comes down from heaven, in their minds would be manna, right? And again, if you look this up, I believe this is during the Feast of Tabernacles. So that would make perfect sense, the timing there, those multiple layers of meaning. Our 5th sign, he heals a blind man on the Sabbath, and we spent a fair amount of time going through this one last week. But they were wondering, how could this man do such signs? Right? And remember, we talked about things like, I am the light of the world, I have come so that those who do not see might see. Those layers of meaning. The 6th sign was raising Lazarus from the dead, and the people heard that Jesus did this sign. So this counts as number 6. And of course he says, shortly after, or during that whole story, he says, I am the resurrection and the life, and then he proves it. And number 7 is the greatest sign of all, the resurrection of himself. And interestingly, it's described as a sign not in chapter 20, but way back in chapter 2. And the Jews said, what sign will you do to show your authority? And Jesus said, destroy this temple. And in 3 days I will raise it up. That was the sign he was going to do. And he sure did. A couple other miraculous events that are not called signs. He walked on water. See, look at me. I said water. Shame on me. He walked on the sea. I actually copied and pasted this from a handout from the Bible Project, so we'll blame it on them. I should have caught it though. And he had the large catch of the fish at the end. That one is a miracle, obviously, but it's not called a sign. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is developing a case for Christ. I started using animations in this, the trans-screen change animations, and so the breaking glass is one of my favorites, sorry. Anyway, so we've got this little outline, that simplified outline from the Bible Project video, And so let's talk about what he's doing here. Each of the marked off boxes, starting with John's baptism in the introduction, and then we've got 4 Jewish feasts, or institutions, and then 4 Jewish feasts, and then raising of Lazarus. So that's 10 marked off boxes there. Each of those effectively acts as a witness being called to testify. That's why I'm calling it a case for Christ. So these are each witnesses, which explains a little bit more about the order that he chose to put them in. He's developing a case. And so what's more important to him is how you develop a case to convince your audience than being perfectly chronological in what he does. So John carefully selects the order in which he calls his witnesses to be the most persuasive. I didn't need to do all that again. Anyway, consider the order of the claims Jesus makes and his miracles. So John the Baptist's testimony, that's somebody else's testimony, right? Confessing him. Then he goes to a wedding. That's a good beginning. Changing water to wine brings to mind the scripture in Isaiah. It's pretty impressive stuff. And then he's at the temple, and it's not really a miraculous thing, but it's definitely a recurring theme, and it's where we are first introduced to, destroy this temple and I'll raise it in 3 days. So it plays an important part early on in the development of the case, right? All right, so this kind of thing continues to build, right? He's convincing a rabbi. Something cool is taking place at a sacred well. There's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes there, and we don't have time to get into all the historical background of what happens at wells between men and women, which is usually if marriage is arranged, or the relationship with the Samaritans and all that kind of stuff. And then we have something going on at the Sabbath, and then the Passover. In each one of these, we have bigger miracles too. Chapter 9, we have a man who was born blind, and remember, he says, we've never heard of anyone healing a man who was born blind from the beginning of time, right? So he's building this, right? And then, of course, it culminates with the resurrection of Lazarus. So at this point, when we have developed our case and greater and greater, you don't want to start with Lazarus because you want to start getting him interested, build up to it, and bam, and he raised Lazarus, by the way. That's a real attention getter, and so what I put here is objections should diminish significantly from the audience or jury, if you will. All right, so now that John has the jury, and I use that term loosely because he's not really developing a defense like in a legal case, but he's doing some similar stuff. Now he's got him in the palm of his hand. He presents what might be the most difficult part, which is teaching about his upside-down kingdom. It's very difficult. It's difficult for us today to think about how in the world do we live and promote the kind of life that Jesus was talking about when we can hardly do it in our daily lives. When somebody does us wrong, we want justice, right? And we don't want to bless our enemy. We don't want to love on them. We don't want to, these types of things. And especially considering, the thing that happened this week in the news, it's really more fresh in our minds about how we treat people we disagree with. I say we, because we all are guilty of something, people we disagree with, dehumanizing them in some way. And, you can't really kill somebody until you dehumanize them to some degree. Because somehow we know that we're all made in the image of God. And you're not going to be guilty of killing the image of God. That would be horrible. So you have to dehumanize somebody in a way before you can actually kill them. I saw this when I was in Desert Storm. People would talk about the Iraqis, the enemy, right? That they weren't really as human as we were in a way. And even when I was in the medical unit, and so we had a bunch of injured POWs, they didn't want to take as good a care of them because they were the enemy, and we hate the enemy, right? And I was like, no. So I got into conflict sometimes with people, but I ended up helping a lot of people because they wouldn't, and I'm glad to have that opportunity. Anyways, so finally John presents the arrest and the trial and the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus, and it's sprinkled with divine claims and upside down teachings all the way through. He's trying, you don't just say it once. This is too heavy of a thing to dump on people. You got to repeat it. It's interesting that he starts with the rabbi washing the disciples' feet. They're just barely getting over that when he's throwing other stuff at them. And then he wraps it up with the epilogue. And so hopefully by this time, he's done a decent job of convincing his audience. And this is why you get little things at the end like, this is the person who wrote down these things and we know that his testimony is true, things like that. So that's the shape. Look at the time, dadgummit. I got one more slide, and it's short. So many of these themes and cross-references and motifs, etc., they're like looking at different faces of a diamond. And so instead of trying to make them all paint in one large picture together, what we do is we look at each face and we appreciate the beauty that it brings, right? Because it's not a flat painting, it's a three-dimensional jewel. And the core of the diamond, sort of the decoder ring for the whole book, is the cross and the resurrection. And that's the book of John.